I always will. I think of a magazine as basically a time capsule of a period, of a moment, of an era. They capture exactly what's happening. Years ago, I couldn't really afford any prints by Avedon, Irving Penn. I always had a love for photography since I was very, very young. So the best way to own the photographs, the images, were to buy the old Vogues and Bazaars. I'd go to flea markets and buy up the old Vogues, for 50 cents, $1. And inside was like a little encyclopedia of photography. The photographs were like fantasy. Beautiful women, beautiful places, in beautiful clothes. It was very exciting. Basically, I took this, my first space over here on 12th Street to house my collection of magazines, storage. One woman had called me. She was an art director at Harper's Bazaar. I'll never forget going to this lady's house, Rachel Crespin, fab old Diana Vreeland type girl. Darling, my basement is just full of these treasures. So I went down to check out the treasures. I almost dropped dead because she had everything. Every Vogue, every Bazaar, going back 40 years, 50 years. Well, sorry about that, Ray. But, and I said, well, what would you like for them? She said, would you give me $1,000 for it all? I said, yeah, absolutely. And just, I'm carting this stuff out. We just loaded it up. And a friend of a friend came over and said, look, I bring a friend to buy some of your magazines. I said, well, I wasn't really keen on the idea, but the gentleman came in, it was Stephen Meisel, and he dropped like $30,000 back in '91. I said, wow, you can make a living, being like a photography and fashion archive. So I just started buying up everything I could find, like multiple copies of Vogue, Bazaar, Glamour, Mademoiselle, photographs. And we turned it into a business. And we just kept buying and buying and buying. And Stephen told Anna Sui, who told Marc Jacobs, who told, Mario Testino, who told David LaChapelle, who told, the word actually got back to Cartier-Bresson and Avedon. And before you know it, I'm going up and having coffee with all these dudes. And the store became very, 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 very popular amongst that set. It just snowballed. I mean, it got crazy. Once they found out, the fashion set and the photography set found out there was a place that would go and put together their sets of Vogue every issue. Designers and photographers collect this stuff like baseball cards. They have to have every one. And it's what they remember when they were young. Stephen told me, when I was 8, I was in the beauty parlor, and my mother, used to read my mother's Vogue while I waited for her, and that's how he had his infatuation with photography and fashion the same way. It's what he saw as a kid and loved. Stephen's dedicated to it. I mean, he knows the history. Anna, they know that the great ones on the level now today, they know their history. They know the Vreeland. They know everything about Vreeland. They know everything about, vintage Halston, Courrèges, Balenciaga. They really know. They do. There's not a picture Avedon ever took that Stephen wouldn't be able to say, yeah, the Circus, 1955. They really know the history. It's reappropriation. People look back at an old magazine and they're inspired. They take the magazine and use it for inspiration for today's magazines, today's layouts, today's, advertisements. I really love the 30s. I love the Deco period. It was also a great period of like Cubism and Surrealism in photography. It hasn't been rivaled. Cecil Beaton, Edward Steichen, all the great photographers just seem to be really on the ball in the 30s. Vogue, Condé Nast had the greatest eye for talent, or his art director, Dr. Aga, really knew who to hire, so he hired, legendary photographers. Living, the greatest photographer right now is Irving Penn, hands down. I mean, nobody could get the exposures that Penn did. You stand there for 8 hours? He's amazing. He still is. My God, he's just unbelievable. Say Magritte and Bosch had a bastard son. It was Melvin Sokolsky, putting women in bubbles, and he shot surrealism, women floating, women flying. I mean, some of the most famous fashion shoots ever were all done by Sokolsky, and he was only 21 when he shot them. Now, Helmut, giant, legend, come on. I mean, he transformed sex into fashion in an artistic way. which it sold the clothes, but it had this visual, it was sexual. But it was sort of, at that point, in like 65, 66, 67, where he really hit it with French Vogue, very hard to pull that off. And, you know, Helmut was the first to be able to do it. You know, then as he had, you know, had more artistic freedom, you know, in Europe, he started pushing the envelope a little more. But there was something so sexy about his photos. You know, I mean, yeah. Collectors are a sick group. You know, wall space is one of the biggest problems in your life. You know, I had a great friend of mine, a collector. You know, he got divorced. He was happy because he said he got a bookshelf. As a collector, there's nothing to me like a vintage fiber vinyl silver gelatin print. You know, the smell of it, the look of it. You know, it's just the sepia type quality you can get from it. I mean, it just adds a dimension to the photograph, which, you know, today they can't do. They just can't replace that feeling. You look at a Gentha print, you know, from the 20s or 30s, they're so deep. It's beyond the image. It's about the graininess, the mood. It just can't be recaptured. My favorite photograph is not from that era. No, it's just I respect the quality and the mood of the photograph. You know, my favorite photograph of all time is a very pop. I mean, it's 1965. It's April. It's Gene Shrimpton in the space helmet, you know, with a pink background with the winker that Dick added. Or no, I'm sorry, the art director was, at Bazaar 65, was Henry Wolf. You know, so Henry said, hey, you know, he superimposed a winking eye on the cover that was sold at newsstands, which the photograph is one Bazaar that the whole world sees my way. Because if you look on an eBay or an Amazon, you know, it's $500. It's the most expensive Bazaar. But it was a pop issue. I think everybody was really starting to experiment with drugs a lot in that period. And I just think everybody had it down in 1965. You know, the photographs were wild. Nobody had ever seen anything like it before. It was when pop really became pop. You know, it was the factory. It was silver. It was trippy. You know, it was trippy, and it was trippy in mainstream fashion. You know, it was about courage. It was about, you know, it was bright. You know, it was sort of LSD-ish. You know, or as I imagined it would be, the girls. When you think of the models, you know, you can think basically by decade. You know, the girls that persevered, you know, there's very, very few. You know, the great ones, who are they? They're Dovima in the 50s. Dick Avedon, go hold those elephants with a chain right now, young lady. And, you know, they did it. The girls had the balls back in the day, you know, to hold 2 elephants on chains. Farushka, the face. Look at that face. You know, Avedon said the most beautiful woman to ever live or be photographed was, you know, Varushka. You know, when you have time to look at visual things, you don't have a lot of time because your piles are like this. I don't want to see the same old schlock. I think basically right now people are thinking to sell magazines, if you don't have an element of shock value, you're not going to sell. You know, shock value, you know, it's worked and made some notorious guys a lot of money. And, you know, I don't get it. I never have, never will. And to me, it exists, but it doesn't exist. I'm lucky enough that in this business, we were able to look at what we love every day, and it gives me the money to afford the prints that I love and the books I love. So, you know, every day is a good day. You know, I can't complain.